atrial fibrillation, a cardiovascular issue. I managed to reverse that using a food and lifestyle approach, and that was the eye-opening moment for me. And so I went back and looked at the average curricula, the average medical training for doctors in the UK, and it was something like 4 or 5 hours on average, but the range was 0 to like 10 to 15 hours in the context of a 6-year degree. So really, really little training for medical professionals out there. And I think, honestly, not listening to any nutrition news that comes from any paper, regardless of whether it's a broadsheet or whether it's a tabloid, is a good strategy. The translation from rodents to humans is shockingly low. Say it's in the ballpark of 80% plus would not be applicable to a human. So when you get to the human trials, it just completely flops. But even the broadsheets get it wrong in a big way. A lot of the time, because they know, unfortunately, we're weak-minded individuals and sensationalism works. Consistency is king. And actually what you want to do is develop an environment where you can be consistent 90% of the time. My rule is 90-10, because if you aim for 90-10, you'll probably get to 80-20.
Welcome to In Good Taste podcast, the podcast on food matters for food lovers. I'm Malika Basu, commentator, advisor, and writer. And every week we bring you sharp, snackable bits of information about what's shaping the world of food and drink today across kitchens, cultures, and continents. From big issues to bite-sized trends, it's all on the table. Now, today, I'm very excited to have one of my old dear friends, Dr. Rupy Aujla. Rupy is a medical professional and is absolutely passionate about breaking down science and nutrition into digestible bites, but also delicious meals for our everyday kitchen. Now, I love his recipes. It's one of the few ways I can get mushrooms into my children. But I also love how he cuts through some really complicated, messy nutrition information. So we are going to talk nutrition communications today. Hello, Rupy. Welcome. What's up, Doc?
Hello. Yeah, thank you so much for that. It's so funny whenever you call me Dr. Rupy, because I'm used to you just calling me Rupy or like having a go at me for something. So yeah,
You're in trouble. You know you're in
I'm
trouble.
usually in
Dr.
trouble.
Rupy Aujla.
I feel like I'm in trouble, but yeah, thank you so much for the intro, and I'm excited to get into this.
Well, we're very excited to have you, but I have to make an admission first that I believe this, the fact that I'm doing a podcast is entirely your fault, because this was your idea, wasn't it?
It might have been when we had
I
dinner the
blame
other
you.
day, and I was like, I just want people to listen to your personality and actually find out the true Malika, because you're literally the most funny person I know. You're absolutely hilarious, and I just like always love hanging out with you. So yeah,
No,
I'm pleased
thank
that you're
you,
doing this.
Rupy. That's really kind. Thank you for making the time. Now, you have this fabulous studio that I've been in, and it is almost like the hub of where the magic happens. I'd love to start by saying that what you do is incredibly tough, isn't it? Communicating nutrition is incredibly complicated,
Yeah.
and science is messy.
Yeah, it's super messy, and I think there's a lot of dogma attached to nutrition. There's a lot of confusion. They're sort of like mini experts because they learn a thing and then they feel like, they've understood everything and they start communicating that, but there's just so much nuance to the conversation. And, food isn't just nutrition. Like, it cuts through everything. The geopolitical landscape, religion, culture, community. It's just so pervasive across society. So you can understand it's a very tricky subject matter to sort of dive into, but it's one I absolutely love. And I came into it through a medical perspective, like from a medical lens. It's how I was able to connect with you, completely outside of my medical arena. And that's just the power and the beauty of food. It's incredible.
I remember it was your first cookbook, I think, where we
Yeah.
met, and you were one of the few people who gave me a little testimonial for my cookbook as well. It's interesting that your route has been in through the lens and the actual education of medicine, science, and nutrition. And that is a real vacuum, isn't it? It's partly why there's just so much noise out there.
Yeah, yeah. Because we as medical professionals still to this day don't get practical nutrition teaching as part of the core curricula of medicine for a lot of reasons. It's already a packed curricula. We're really ill-equipped to have those conversations with patients in clinical environments where actually, if you look at modern disease, there's just so much that is down to poor diet. And that's not necessarily because of poor choices from the individual, but the environments that we've created where the only choice is a poor one, like cheap, accessible, hyper-palatable, ultra-processed foods are dominant in people's diets for a number of reasons outside of just choice as well. Sometimes it is choice, though. And so, that was my realization after medical school. When I became a junior doctor, I had my own ill health issues myself, a cardiovascular issue. I managed to reverse that using a food and lifestyle approach, and that was the eye-opening moment for me. And so I went back and looked at the average curricula, the average medical training for doctors in the UK, and it was something like 4 or 5 hours on average, but the range was 0 to like 10 to 15 hours in the context of a 6-year degree. So really, really little training for medical professionals out there. And that's where I started to investigate what was going on in the US, their culinary medicine programs. Why don't we have a culinary medicine program in the UK? And we started our first one in 2018 at Bristol Medical School. And now there's one at UCL where they actually get taught in a cooking kitchen environment at Westminster Kingsway with a dietitian, with a professional chef and a medical professional, someone like a GP. And these medical students are actually being taught to not only cook and look after their own health, but also how to have practical nutrition conversations in clinics so everyone can understand the power of food in medicine.
I mean, it really beggars belief that, the people advising us on our health and nutrition don't actually get a proper education in it. And of course,
Yeah.
that starts even earlier, doesn't it, Ruby? Because I didn't go to school in the UK. But there, as far as I know, and as far as I can see from my kids and my friends' kids, there's no nutrition education in schools, is there?
No, it's very up and down. I think there are some schools that do put a lot of emphasis on cooking and like growing vegetables and taking them out, and I believe it is part of the curricula, but it's largely ignored. So, I mean, if you ask your average child when they've come out of school, like, did they get cooking classes? Did they understand about nutrition? The majority of them are going to say no. So it's something that we should really be instilling in our youth at an early age. And, I've got a young boy now, a 10-month-old Raphael, and we're already getting him to experience so many different foods, not only to improve his palate and widen the aperture of foods that he's comfortable with, but also, particularly when he gets a bit older, so he can actually develop the skills to look after himself.
It's interesting because I wonder whether some of this ladders into the issue, which is, we're all shortcut takers. Like, I love a miracle pill. I shouldn't probably declare this publicly, but, the idea of just taking a shot of something or taking a spoon of a powder and mixing it into water and you get your 30 plants, a week is, I think we're all naturally drawn to it. And
Oh yeah.
what's your view about some of this, some of
Yeah,
these?
I think we're all drawn to a shortcut, right? I think we're all guilty of this, a shortcut to wealth, get rich quick. No one wants to get rich slow. Everyone wants to get rich quick, right?
Oh, yeah.
And the
What's the
same,
cute?
yeah, and like no one wants to wait 60 months for an abs. They want to wait 6 weeks for abs. No one wants to, and the list can go on. So these sort of quick fixes, whilst they sound like incredible and sometimes they're dressed up with like a ton of science, the basics are the ones that we really need to be focusing on. And I have this saying in the last two of my books, consistency is king. And actually what you want to do is develop an environment where you can be consistent 90% of the time. My rule is 90-10 because if you aim for 90-10, you'll probably get to 80-20.
Okay, well,
Just with modern pressures and everything else. And so for me, the foundations of good nutrition, if we're just going to focus on nutrition, is getting enough fiber, quality fats, deprocessing your diet, ensuring you're getting enough protein, and eating an anti-inflammatory, colorful plate. And that's what you want to over-index on. A green powder, a seed mix, even things that I'm big fans of, like psyllium husk and chia and, dehydrated moringa. Like these are all phenomenal. Like they're great, but like they are the 1%. They're the cherry on top, and that's what I would focus on and spend money on after you fix the sort of core pillars of nutrition. And the other thing is that, even though I'm a food guy, the biggest thing I think when it comes to protecting ourselves against cancer, reducing inflammation, improving our mood, ensuring that we're aging as healthy as possible, and even slowing aging, is actually movement and exercise.
Yes, of
So,
course. You
so
forget that
it's,
one day.
yeah, it's like that's actually what we need to be like those foundations, those core pillars, like figure out, spend time figuring out how you're going to do that, whether it's meal planning, whether it's, shopping for the cheapest option, whether it's soaking beans from scratch so you can do it in bulk, using freezer foods. Like that's what you want to spend time on. Leave the supplements to one side. They certainly have a role, but they're not going to be this panacea that they're sold as.
That's really top advice. And one of the things I love about what you do is you find ways to fit things into lifestyles. Everything is about pay more attention to what you eat and
Well,
drink.
you know what? It's so funny. Kids these days are really getting into some of these burner phone types. So you're just down with the kids, Malika. Like
Yeah,
you
okay, thanks. Let's get my teenagers to believe that, and then we're talking, yes. Look, I want to bring you back to this conversation about nutrition miscommunication because, of course, a lot of us in these busy lifestyles, we are at the mercy, if you like, of people, experts who are giving us information. And there's been some new research that shows that, your lived experience and your own personal bias is very much tied to the advice you give. And nutrition, the term itself, is not protected, is it?
No, nutritionist is not a protected term. Registered nutritionist and registered dietitian is, but people sort of in the public don't really know the difference. I mean, if you ask anyone on the street what's the difference between a registered nutritionist and a nutritionist, they'll be like, it's the same thing. But there's a very different sort of accreditation process. You have to demonstrate to the AFN or the BDA that you've done certain exams and you've practiced a certain way and you've done CPD points and that kind of stuff to maintain sort of like the practice. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of like self-fashioning, but then to sort of like take the other side, I've met some very sensible and educated and well-rounded nutritional therapists that disagree with the traditional approach of nutrition and dietetics of just following guidelines. And I think nutrition is just not a one size fits all. And I think we all know that. What may work for an individual of a certain background, a European Caucasian background, might not be the same sort of diet that enables someone from our diaspora, our background to thrive. And it's a real tricky
Exactly.
one because there isn't a clear biomarker of success that can determine what diet should look like for each of those two individuals. We can look at things like cholesterol, we can look at things like weight, we can do DEXA scans, look at visceral fat, but there isn't one way, I think, that is like one clear marker of success for those two individuals. So I'm really like happy for an individual to do something like a keto diet if they really want to do something and they thrive, they feel great on it, the numbers look great, that's fine from my perspective and from a lot of nutritional therapist perspective. But from a dietetics point of view that is trained in a very specific way, regardless of like whether that individual feels well and regardless of whether the numbers look great, the sort of stance is, well, that's not going to work long term and I think you should stop that. And I think that's where the sort of the conversation gets shut down. And this is where you get sort of camps, because you're not listening to people who are literally telling you, look, I feel great on this. I've cured my IBD on this. So I've got rid of my migraines, or I became fertile. These stories are really, really powerful. And I think if we add nuance to them, we add context and we explain, okay, this might be why it's worked for that individual. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work for everyone, but at least we can like begin to have that conversation. Then we can sort of dispel and perhaps mellow some of the fighting, the infighting that we get online. And so that's why you'll never find me calling out people online or saying this is BS, or like, this a researcher is just cherry picking science, because I just think like that's not helpful for the majority of people who are on the sidelines just trying to figure out like, how do I look after my own health?
You're so right, and you need to be instinctive about it as well, because every body is literally different, isn't it? And there are those traditions, and culture is my big thing, right? So cultural markers within traditions and communities are such a big deal. And one of the things you touch on is this idea of the screaming. You can see the battle lines drawn online, and the screaming headlines don't help. Coffee is great for you one day,
Yeah.
but not this sort of coffee, and eating so much of this could prevent you from getting cancer. And it is a minefield for the
Yeah.
average person, which is actually what draws me to what you do so much. But are there some red flags we can look out for? Are there some, do you have a guide for the average individual on what
Yeah,
they
I would
should
say, I mean, first off, if the Daily Mail says it, ignore it. I always get like, I get
looking forward
this
to the
more.
legal letter?
I've just said, like, I always get some researcher from one of the morning shows, could be This Morning or BBC Live, whatever it is, or like some breakfast show. I'm like, oh, we got this headline about cheese. And then I'm like, okay, fine, send me the link. And then it's like, it's Daily Mail.
Oh,
And then they've looked at like some rodent study, and they've like pulled this out, and it's like, we fed these mice a high fat diet, and it says cheese is going to give you a heart attack within 6 months. I don't know, some like ridiculous statement like that. And you just can't say these things from the cherry picked studies of the headlines. And I think, honestly, not listening to any nutrition news that comes from any paper, regardless of whether it's a broadsheet or whether it's a tabloid, is a good strategy. Trust me, guys, because even the broadsheets, not to pick on the Daily Mail, but even the broadsheets get it wrong in a big, big way a lot of the time, because they know, unfortunately, we're weak-minded individuals and sensationalism works. Artificial sweeteners are going to give you cancer. Okay, great. They looked at, an epidemiology study. It might have been a study that's published in a really reputable journal, but you have to, from a nutrition science point of view, you need to look at the weight of evidence. You need to look at all the other studies that were done to determine actually what is the consensus on this subject. Is this something that is a type 1 carcinogen, or is it something that could be probable, or is it something, and then come up with a reasonable approach to how you navigate this. It's one of, as you can tell, it's one of my bugbears. Whenever
no,
I
we love
get,
it. No, keep ranting. I'm really enjoying it. I,
I,
I've got at least another 20 minutes of your time. This is
I
all
just,
music to my ears.
honestly, it's just, I just wish people would not, and I know it's tempting, but it's just, don't put your attention in the hands of newspapers and media outlets that are not out there to educate you. They're out there to steal your attention. They're out there to monetize your attention in the form of advertising. And the easiest way to attract someone is to put a sensationalist headline on top of an article. And so I would say that's tip number one. Just ignore anything that you find in a broadsheet paper or tabloid to do with nutrition.
That's
That's
the
not
top
what.
tip.
Yeah, I honestly,
Yeah, yeah,
I honestly think that people would fare a lot better, because even the coffee thing, like, let's say there's an article, which I'm sure there will be if we just Google, like, the latest science on coffee. Coffee can given to Alzheimer's patients reduces their
Yes.
cognitive issues, by like 5 years, something like that. Some ridiculous statement. Coffee has got over 20,000 studies looking at its pros and cons, right? So to look at one of those studies and draw a conclusion based on that, whether it's positive or negative, is just the wrong approach. When I look at coffee and when I speak to coffee experts in this field, they've been scouring the research for years and they've come up with a consensus opinion that's based on this a rigorous approach that balances all the pros and cons, and which is why I can safely say coffee is incredible. It's full of polyphenols. It has chlorogenic acid. There are a whole bunch of novel chemicals that we find that protect our cells, and it's associated with improvements in metabolic health, cardiovascular disease, and dementia. Does that mean that everyone should be drinking gallons of coffee? No, it doesn't. There seems to be a positive effect around 2 to 3 cups per day for most people. But let's say you're sensitive to caffeine, as an example. You might not thrive on having 2 cups or even 1 cup of coffee. It might make you feel a little bit uncomfortable. It might give you gastrointestinal decaf. You might benefit from decaf, but you might not even like the taste of coffee. So there are a whole bunch of other options for you, like rooibos
Important.
tea, or like maybe matcha, or maybe hibiscus tea, or maybe something that's more inclined to your culture. Maybe you're from a Middle Eastern background, Turkish background. You like mint, you like saffron. Like these are going to give you polyphenols as well. So these are the kind of things that you won't be able to tease out from an article that's telling you need to drink coffee because otherwise you're going to get Alzheimer's. It's just it's that kind of stuff, and it's very hard to have that in a sort of like a little soundbite or to fit it into an article.
And here we are back talking about this issue that we have with being shortcut takers. We all
Yeah,
want
yeah,
to be,
yeah,
that is just not possible, is it? Like that is actually coffee irritates my stomach. So that is a very, very, it felt relatable. As
yeah,
an example, you picked on rat studies as well. So there's a few things I want to run past you. Rat studies, because rodents, we are not rodents. Last time I checked, I mean, some of us are quite ratty. But mostly we are not rats, and so they don't always equate in humans. It's kind of evidence emerging. Is that right?
yeah. And you know what? I think people will be shocked at how many rodent studies that are really positive in the lab and have been demonstrated in multiple different sites. So what a terminology is replicability. So
Right.
a chemical that's given to a rat in one lab and then given to another lab, another rat in a different lab in a different part of the country or a different country altogether, gives it a little bit more weight that there's a true effect occurring. Even when that is the case, the translation from rodents to humans is shockingly low. I can't quote the exact number, but I would say it's in the ballpark of 80% plus would not be applicable to a human. So when you get to the human trials, it just completely flops. And this is why drug studies that are performed by pharmaceutical companies and invested in are just so expensive because they are doing these investigations time and time again and spending literally hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in this sort of research process to determine cause and effect. And rodents are just such a poor model to look at and replicate in humans. There are a few things that we can definitely translate. So things like exercise or the mechanisms behind why the observed effect of exercise is important in humans. But when it comes to like supplements or green powders or whatever it might be, looking at rodent studies is just a really bad marker. So when you see a paper and they're referencing a rodent study, I disregard it almost immediately. It's like it's
Wow.
interesting, but it's like okay, it doesn't like who cares? It like this could be a complete nothing burger, and in fact, 4 out of 5 times it will be a nothing burger. So really don't look at them.
Gosh, wow. Okay, that's slightly blown my mind, which is reinforcing again. The other one I want to ask you about is correlation and causation.
Okay.
And that sounds terribly complicated because it is. Because just because two things are correlated doesn't mean one thing is causing the other. Is that right? Is that
Yeah,
how
that
you
is
work?
true. Yeah, absolutely. So, what's an example I can use? So let's imagine people who drink a green powder every single day it has a correlation with better muscle health. Okay, so you've got two variables. I drink a dehydrated green drink every single day, and then there's like thousands of us, and we all spend £50 a month on a green drink, and that is correlated. If we look at all the muscles and our general health, let's imagine we had this study, we had loads and loads of money pumped into it, and we could do DEXA scans to look at everyone's muscle health. There is a correlation between these two different things. Now, it doesn't mean that the green powder is causing the improvement in
Mm,
muscle health. What's most likely happening is I'm of a certain income. I can spend money on my health and wellness. I choose to spend that on a very expensive green powder that I'm spending £50 on a month. And because I'm into my health and wellness, I tend to go to the gym more. I tend to have the time to invest in going to a gym and lifting heavy weights in a sweaty, dark environment with loads of other people all wearing Lululemon. So there is the correlation, but that does not mean it is causing that effect. And this is where people get it really, really wrong. So organic food might be another thing. I happen to believe that organic food is better than conventional because we want to reduce our burden of pesticides and environmental pollutants. But that aside, it's very hard because it's confounded, and a confounder is where you get these mixed variables, but it's confounded with those who choose organic food tend to opt for other healthier lifestyles. We're less likely to smoke. We're less likely to have poor ultra processed foods in our diet. We're less likely to overconsume poor quality fats and large amounts of saturated fats. We're less likely to have tons of processed meat in our diet. We're more likely to go to the gym, go to sleep early, drink plenty of water, drink less alcohol, etc., etc. So there are all
mm,
these different variables in there, but it's a very important concept to get your head around, this correlation versus correlation, causation versus correlation, because that is often mixed up in these newspaper articles and headlines. They don't account for that, and they look at the correlation and they present it to you like it's causation.
this is fascinating stuff. And in fact, organic food was one of the examples I was going to talk to you
Mm.
about because, people will often say, well, there's no research to prove that organic food is healthier. And that is partly true, but it's because it is incredibly complicated. It's not
Yeah.
so easy to isolate the benefit of organic food in our diet. I mean, on the other side, common sense would dictate that eating things with a whole load of toxic chemicals sprayed on them or grown with a whole load of toxic chemicals that you know nothing about
Mm.
can't be good for you.
Yeah.
So, it is really quite complicated. The final thing is who pays for these studies. I know
Yeah.
lots of medical professionals have talked about it, and that's not obvious to us, is it? As everyday consumers, when you look at a study, you don't know who's funded it and what some of the conflicts of interest are.
And honestly, this is something that's becoming pervasive on the other side as well. So from the study side, you'll definitely have funding like the dairy and the meat industry trying to downplay the impacts of red meat on cardiovascular health and cancer. But also on the other side, you've got people. So you've got the British Drinks Association, who represent, I'm probably getting their name wrong, but they represent soft drink manufacturers in the UK. So, the sodas and all the big brands that you've definitely heard of, paying nutrition professionals and doctors to downplay the impact of artificial sweeteners. Now, I would say that is an erroneous use of marketing spend, and I think it's really damaging for the profession for anyone to accept money to sort of downplay the impacts of things like aspartame and some of these other additives. I'm on the fence about artificial sweeteners. I think the pragmatic view is that they can certainly help people remove sugar from their diet in the short term, but as a long-term solution, I think there's still question marks on whether they are pro-cancerous, they are detrimental to our guts, they even are beneficial in terms of reducing your sugar consumption, because they trick your brain into thinking that you've consumed something sweet, but you actually haven't satisfied that sweet craving. And so there is some anecdote of people actually over-consuming sugar whilst they're consuming diet sodas. And it's happening even within the agricultural industry. You know, Monsanto have been caught paying dietitians to downplay the impacts of glyphosate, which I think is horrendous personally, because glyphosate is very well known to cause issues to the growers. People are exposed to high amounts of glyphosate. Glyphosate has been shown to disrupt our gut microbiota. There's already a push to remove glyphosate in our food chain. And also the company, I'm not too sure whether it's Bayer and Bayer or Monsanto, but any one of these large petrochemical companies have actually had to pay out millions of dollars in lawsuits because of people coming to harm from this product. And then you have dietitians saying there's nothing wrong with glyphosate. And it's just like that for me is mind-boggling. So it
is quite crazy, but
it's a
also
real
no one funds the
minefield.
other side. Who's funding the other side for the balance argument? There's no
Yeah.
money going into that. So
No.
you tend to, and by the way, I know a thing or two about this because I've had a long career in communications, right? You
Yeah.
might find that I wasn't on the inside track of some of these things.
You were like, glyphosate's fine. Don't worry, guys. Eat,
No, no.
eat your cereals.
Well, it is tricky because then you get a very one-sided view of what's being put out there because that's what's attracting the funding. So
Yeah.
that's very tricky. Look, this has been fascinating. My mind is boggled, as I was hoping it would be. But if you had to give people three really practical rules. We talked about the ignore the headlines.
Yeah.
Yes. I think rat studies is a really good one as well. Is there one final thing you'd like to leave us with on navigating nutritional information online? And of course, the final point from me would be they should be listening to your podcast and following your
No,
work.
that's very sweet of you.
But
I would
what,
say
what else would you say?
it's not as much of a tangible point, but I would say people need to become a lot more intuitive about what works for them and how their bodies work, and to become experts of their own health in all domains, whether that's exercise, nutrition, sleep. Because whilst the advice that I give is fairly generic, eat your BBGs, have beans, berries, greens, seeds, nuts every day, ensure you get enough protein, make sure you get that from majorly plant-based sources, that might not be the right advice for every single individual. There are certain people that might not thrive with having that much fiber in their diet, and they need to go on something that's actually quite low FODMAP. They might not thrive on having certain ingredients in their diet, like, legumes, and actually they need to have more broths to heal their gut. So I think like becoming a lot more intuitive about what works for you, listening to your body, listening to your gut, as traditional medicine has taught us for millennia, I think that's really where the opportunity lies for people who want to educate themselves more. Of instead of being dogmatic and following like a guru like me online, become your own guru, become your own sort of internal expert, and that's how you're gonna achieve like ultimate health and well-being, because you're listening to your body, and your body is so intelligent and it's giving you those signals by your skin, by your tongue, by your guts, by your mind. Like, is it busy? There's so much connection there, but we've sort of offloaded that to people on our screens, to people on our ears, to people on our on our TVs. And actually, you want to own that again. Like, become your own expert, become your own health guru.
That is so profound, Rupi, and so true. And what a lovely way to bring this to an end. That was really fascinating. Thank you so much for coming
Thanks.
along.
I love how surprised you were, Malika.
I know. Sorry, it wasn't going to come out like that. I was
I'm only
surprised about the range of topics we've covered. I'm going to have to go and recharge my burner phone now.
joking.
But thank you tons for doing this, and good luck with the rest. I shall be watching and listening intently.
Thank you. Thanks, Malika. I appreciate it.